The Heritage Preservation Council's letter described Ashworth Manor as a structure of compromised integrity, presenting ongoing risk to public safety and any persons engaged in assessment activities, which was their way of saying, "The house is trying to kill the people we keep sending in." 3 structural engineers, 2 demolition contractors, 1 very unlucky insurance adjuster. None of them had gotten past the east wing before something fell, shifted, groaned, or otherwise communicated its displeasure in load-bearing terms. The council wanted it gone. It sat on 12 acres of prime Surrey countryside that a hotel chain had been quietly circling for 4 years, and the building itself was officially a liability. Unofficially, it was a problem nobody could quite explain. The surveys kept coming back wrong. The measurements didn't match between visits. There was a persistent issue with room count that 3 separate firms had flagged independently and then declined to put in writing. I was the 4th architectural conservator the council had retained. The first 3 had submitted reports of escalating vagueness and then stopped returning calls. My name is Marcus Webb. I was 31, recently out of a 5-year contract with English Heritage that had ended on reasonable terms and left me with a reputation for taking on the difficult ones. Not difficult in the sense of complicated stonework or contested ownership. Difficult in the sense that nobody else would go. I read all 3 previous reports before I drove out. The first was thorough. The second was thorough but had 3 pages near the back that were just measurements that didn't add up, annotated in increasingly tense handwriting. The third was 4 paragraphs and ended mid-sentence. I packed for a week and told my sister I'd call on Thursday. Ashworth Manor was built in 1887 by a man named Colonel Ashworth who had, by all accounts, very specific ideas about rooms and very little idea about structural logic. It had been extended in 1903, again in 1921, once more in 1958 by someone who had clearly never spoken to anyone who had worked on it before, and then left alone until it passed through 3 estates and came to rest, finally, with no living owner and a heritage designation that had expired 2 years ago when the last trustee died. It was red brick and pale limestone and a great deal of Victorian decorative ambition. The roof had 4 distinct pitches. There were 7 chimneys. The east wing had a conservatory attached to it that looked, architecturally, as though it had been added by a different house entirely and had simply decided to stay. I stood at the gate for a moment before I opened it. The house looked back. I don't mean that in a Gothic way. I mean there was a quality to it, the way the upper windows sat in the morning light, the angle of the main gable, the slightly asymmetric placement of the front door that gave the impression of a face in a state of considered attention. Not hostile, waiting. "Right," I said to nobody. I opened the gate. The front door was unlocked, not broken unlocked. The council's letter had said the property was secured, but the handle turned cleanly under my hand, and the door swung open with the slightly oversmooth action of a mechanism that had been maintained recently. The entrance hall was dim and cool and smelled of old paper and something faintly mineral, like chalk or rain-wet stone. The floor was original encaustic tile, red and black and cream, largely intact. The staircase ahead of me was solid oak, the banister recently dusted, which was wrong. The property had been unoccupied for 2 years. I set down my bag and took out my notebook. The thing about architectural conservation is that you learn to read buildings the way other people read faces. The proportion of a window tells you something. The way a floor has settled tells you something. The relationship between a ceiling height and the room beneath it tells you something. Buildings communicate if you know how to listen. Ashworth Manor was talking. I just couldn't parse it yet. I started with the entrance hall. I was measuring the ceiling height 9 feet 4, which matched the 1903 records I'd brought, when I heard movement from the upper floor. Not the creak of an old building settling. Footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, coming toward the top of the staircase. I put my hand on my measuring tape and waited. She came around the upper landing with the composed certainty of someone who had every right to be where she was, and was mildly inconvenienced to find it otherwise occupied. She was tall, nearly 2 meters, I thought, though the ceiling up there made it hard to judge. Her skin was the deep arterial red of old terracotta, almost exactly the color of the manor's brick exterior. Her hair was black and very straight, worn loose to her shoulders. Her eyes, when they found mine across the open staircase, were the particular silver pale of old mirrors, not reflective, but possessing that quality of depth that old glass has, the sense that there is something on the other side of it. She wore what looked at first like a high-collared dark coat. It wasn't on closer inspection. The material moved with her in a way fabric doesn't, and there were faint luminous markings at the collar and cuffs. Geometric, precise, the kind of thing I associated with Seraph functional dress, which meant she was either Seraph or dressed to pass as Seraph, which would be an unusual choice. I had seen Seraph before, working the heritage portfolio. There was a Seraph cultural attaché in the London diplomatic circuit, who occasionally appeared at English heritage events and always seemed faintly bored by the stonework. This woman had that same quality of someone for whom a very long span of time has made most things less surprising than they used to be. She looked at me. She looked at my measuring tape. She looked at my bag and the notebook in my hand. "You are the fourth," she said. Her English was excellent and inflected with something I couldn't quite place, not an accent exactly, but a precision of diction that suggested she had learned it academically rather than conversationally, and then had a very long time to practice. "The council keeps sending humans." "And you keep being here," I said, because it seemed like the relevant observation. A pause. Something shifted in the mirror-pale eyes, not warmth exactly, more like the slight adjustment a door makes when it decides to open. "Yes," she said, "I do." Her name was Soul. That was the short form. She offered the long one and then said, with the particular patience of someone who had been doing this for a while, that the full Seraph designation had 14 syllables and a tonal component that human vocal architecture couldn't produce, and Soul was what the Colonel had called her and what had stuck. The Colonel, Ashworth, 1887. "You've been here since 1887, I said. "I arrived in 1889, she said. The Colonel took some time to trust. He was a suspicious man, but a reasonable one, once he was satisfied that I meant no harm to the collection. We were in what had been, according to the 1921 extension plans I'd brought, a drawing room. It was now something else. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelving, and the shelving held what I recognized, after a moment's adjustment, as archive materials: rolled documents, flat storage cases, stacked portfolios, sealed canisters of a type I didn't recognize, and what appeared to be an entire section of crystalline storage units that were definitely not from 1921 or any other human century. There were also, I noticed, maps. An enormous number of maps. Some were paper, some were printed on materials I couldn't identify, and several were projected, faintly luminous outlines floating a centimeter off their backing surfaces, updating slowly in ways that paper maps don't do. The room smelled of old paper and chalk, and that mineral quality from the entrance hall. Standing in it felt like being inside a library that was also, somehow, a working instrument. "What is all of this?" I asked. "My work," she said. "I am a cartographer, among other things. The collection spans approximately 400 years of Seraph survey work on this region of the galaxy, with a significant subcollection of Earth cartographic materials that the Colonel contributed and that I have continued to expand." She paused. "He was also a cartographer of a kind. It was the basis of our understanding." I looked at a wall of rolled documents. Some of them had labels in English, in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Some had labels in script I couldn't read. Some appeared to have no labels at all, which in an archival context is either deliberate or a disaster. "The council wants to demolish the building," I said. "I am aware." Her voice was level. "They have been trying for some time." "The previous assessors left," she said without inflection. "The House assisted their departures." I turned to look at her. "The House assisted." "It is a strong word, perhaps, but yes." She looked at me steadily. "Ashworth Manor has preferences. It has had them for as long as I have been here. The Colonel noticed it too, though he attributed it to providence rather than architecture. It does not like certain kinds of attention. It has communicated this in structural terms to the people who have come to end it." "And me," I said. "I'm here to assess it for demolition." "You are here to assess it," she said. "I am watching to see what the House does." What the House did by the end of the first day was cooperate. Not dramatically. It didn't rearrange itself or produce rooms from nowhere, though I was keeping count carefully, and the numbers were already not adding up in ways I was documenting without yet theorizing. But the floors were solid under my feet. The ceilings stayed where they were. The staircase bore my weight without complaint. The east wing, which had supposedly dropped a substantial portion of its plasterwork on one of the previous structural engineers, was entirely stable. I measured, I photographed, I logged. Soul moved through the house the way the house itself moved, with a settled purposiveness that suggested long familiarity. She answered my questions when I had them and did not follow me into rooms I entered alone, which I appreciated. She did not try to prevent me from accessing anything. At 4 in the afternoon, I sat down on the bottom step of the main staircase and wrote up my notes for the day. She came out of the archive room and paused at the end of the hall. "You are still here," she said. "It's 4 o'clock. The others were gone by noon." I looked up from my notebook. Something happened to them by noon. She tilted her head slightly. The movement was Seraph, I thought, not quite the same axis as a human head tilt, slightly more lateral. "Yes. Nothing's happened to me." "No." I wrote another line of notes. She stayed where she was. "Does that surprise you?" I asked. A long pause. Long enough that I looked up again. "Yes," she said, and this time the word had a texture to it that the earlier ones hadn't. Not a surprise that something had gone wrong, a surprise at something going right, which is a different quality entirely, and one I recognized because I heard it occasionally from clients who had stopped expecting their buildings to be saved. I stayed the night. I had planned to. I'd brought a sleeping bag and a week's worth of provisions, because I was thorough and also because I'd read the 3 previous reports. But there was a difference between planning to stay and finding yourself still there at 11 o'clock with a lamp going and 6 pages of notes, and a house that had not once tried to injure you. I had claimed a small room off the entrance hall that had probably been a butler's pantry and was now empty and dry and had a working radiator, which was more than I'd expected. Soul's rooms, I gathered, were in the east wing. I didn't go there uninvited. At some point in the evening, she appeared in the doorway of the pantry room with a cup that held something hot and set it on the floor inside the door without comment. It tasted like tea that had been made by someone who understood the structural principles of tea, but had not, in the early iterations, fully accounted for the variable of human preference. It was slightly too strong and slightly too mineral and entirely acceptable. "Thank you," I said. She nodded. She started to leave. "Soul," she stopped. "Why hasn't anyone from the Seraph diplomatic mission been involved in this? If the archive is genuinely 400 years of survey work. The mission considers the collection lost." Her voice was even, but it had the same quality as the staircase in uncertain light, solid enough, but you wanted to check your footing. "I left the formal Survey Corps in 1901. It was a disagreement about methodology that became a disagreement about institutional philosophy, and then became something that could not be repaired. The archive is mine. The mission would not consider its preservation their concern. And if the building comes down, the collection cannot be moved in its current state. Much of it is tied to the structural conditions here: temperature, humidity, the particular quality of the electromagnetic environment. The colonel understood this. He designed the 1903 extension to my specifications, which is why it looks the way it does. She paused. It is why the house looks the way it does. He gave me the east wing, and I have been building its conditions to specification for 123 years. I looked at my notes, at the floor plan I'd been building, at the numbers that didn't add up. The rooms, I said. Yes. The room count is wrong, across all 4 surveys and mine, wrong differently each time. The house grows when it needs to, she said, with the equanimity of someone who has had a long time to decide that this is simply a fact. Not quickly, not dramatically, but when there is something that needs a space, the space tends to appear. The colonel called it providence. I have my own theories. I have not resolved them. I sat with that for a moment. Right, I said. You are taking this very calmly. I'm an architectural conservator, I said. I've seen a lot of strange buildings. This is the first one I've thought actually had good taste about it. The pause this time was different, shorter, and something in the mirror-pale eyes shifted the way light does on water when something beneath it moves. Good taste, she said. The 1903 extension. The proportions are unusual, but they work. Whatever you specified, it was right. She looked at me for a moment in a way that was not quite the way she had looked at me before. Then she left and I finished the tea, which was better when it cooled. By the end of the second day, I knew the building well enough to understand what it was. Ashworth Manor was not, in conservation terms, a compromised structure. It was an adapted one. The internal environment of the East Wing was, when I borrowed Sol's monitoring instruments to check, which she permitted without comment, maintained at tolerances no passive brick and limestone building could achieve. The thermal consistency alone would have required active systems, but there were no active systems I could find, or none that were human-made. The East Wing maintained itself. I stopped trying to explain it in terms of conventional structural engineering and started cataloging it in terms of outcomes, which is what good conservation work comes down to eventually anyway. The West Wing was different. Original fabric, original condition, original problems, 2 joist runs that needed sistering, a chimney stack with mortar loss, a section of external wall where the pointing had failed and damp had got in. Genuine work to be done, the kind I could specify and cost and defend to a preservation board. I was in the West Wing's upper corridor, photographing the damp patch, when Sol appeared in the doorway behind me. You are making repair specifications, she said. I'm documenting defects. The repair specifications come after. You are making a case for preservation. I lowered the camera. That's what a conservation assessment is. I document condition, I identify what needs doing, I make a case to the council for what's technically feasible. If the condition supports preservation, I say so. If it doesn't, I say that instead. The previous assessors were commissioned to recommend demolition. I was commissioned to assess. There's a difference, and I took the commission on the basis of it. I turned to look at her. Did you know that before I arrived? The silver-pale eyes held mine steadily. I read the commissioning correspondence. It was left in the entrance hall. I do not know if it was left for me or simply left. And I thought it was likely to be the same as the others, with less dramatic results. She paused. I was revising that assessment by the end of the first morning. On what basis? She considered this for a moment with the deliberate care of someone who does not use words casually. You asked the house questions, she said at last. The others told it what they intended to do with it. You asked it what it was. I have noticed that the house responds differently to those approaches. I thought about the way I'd stood in the entrance hall on the first morning, the way I'd read the tile work, the weight distribution in the staircase, the 1903 extension. It's just conservation practice, I said. Perhaps, she said. But it is not what I have seen before in the humans who have come here. She turned to leave. Soul, she stopped, not turning. For what it's worth, the collection. I've seen archive conditions before. I've consulted on the Serapith materials at the British Museum, which is not the same scale but is the same philosophy. What you've built here is extraordinary. The environment, the organization, the integration with the physical fabric of the building. I paused. The colonel was right to give you the East Wing. It was a correct decision. She turned then. The movement was slow, and the expression on her terracotta face was one I couldn't parse initially. Not blankness, but the kind of containment that happens when something that has been held for a very long time meets something it didn't expect. He said that himself, she said quietly. In his last entry, he wrote, I believe it to have been the best architectural decision of my considerable career, and I have built things on 3 continents. She paused. He was not generally a sentimental man. No, I said, but he was right. She looked at me for a long moment. Yes, she said, he was. I called the council on day 4. The contact, there was a man named Hargreaves who had the energy of someone who had been managing a straightforward property disposal for 4 years and had run out of patience for complications. He picked up on the second ring. Webb, what's the situation? Complex, I said. I'll need the rest of the week, possibly a second week. A pause of profound displeasure. The hotel group has been waiting. The building is in better structural condition than any of the 3 previous reports suggested. The East Wing is performing in ways I haven't fully documented yet, and there is an occupant. An occupant, his voice went up. The property has been unoccupied since. There is a Serapith national who has been in continuous residence since 1889, and who has a material interest in the archive held within the East Wing. I would recommend that before any demolition or disposal decision is made, the council takes legal advice on the residency status and cultural heritage implications of the collection. Silence. I'll send you the preliminary report by Friday, I said, but I'd hold off calling the hotel group until you've read it. More silence, of a different quality. How is it, Hargreaves said, with genuine bafflement, that 3 professional firms couldn't get through the front door and you're in there taking phone calls? I asked it nicely, I said. I hung up. When I told Soul about the call, she was in the main archive room, rehousing a section of flat storage cases that had been disturbed. I had been careful, but some of my measuring work in the adjacent room had, apparently, created vibration she was now correcting for. She listened without stopping work. You told them about me, she said. I told them there was an occupant with a legal interest that needed professional advice, which is true, and which, once it's in a formal report from a commissioned assessor, is considerably harder to ignore than it would otherwise be. She set down the case she was holding, her hands long-fingered, the same deep terracotta as her face, with the faint geometric markings at the wrist that the functional coat had at the cuffs, were very still. The mission will not support a claim, she said. I told you, the archive is considered lost. The mission doesn't have to support a claim. You've been in continuous residence for 135 years, caring for a collection that has demonstrable cultural and scientific value. That's a different kind of claim. It's not diplomatic, it's historical. I paused. I know a heritage lawyer who works on non-human residency cases. She's handled 3 Serapith matters. She's good. Soul turned to look at me. The mirror-pale eyes had that quality again, the light on water, the sense of something moving beneath. Why are you doing this? She said. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, which I appreciated. No hedging in it, no social maneuvering, just the question. I thought about it honestly. Because the building is worth saving, I said, and the collection inside it is worth saving more. And because you've been here 135 years doing good work alone, and the council is trying to knock it down so a hotel chain can put in a spa, and that is, I paused, looking for the word, an outcome I would find very difficult to put my name to. She was quiet for a moment. The other assessors, she said, did they know about the collection? The second one found this room. It's in the report, 3 sentences, then the report stops making sense. I looked around at the walls of archive material, the floating maps, the crystal storage with its slow, luminous update. I think it was too much. I think they didn't have a frame for it. And you? I've worked with Seraph materials before. I know what a 400-year survey archive looks like, more or less, and I know what it's worth. I met her eyes. I know what this is worth. It's extraordinary, Soul. It should not be in a building the council is trying to demolish. It should be in a building that's been properly preserved and protected and recognized, which is what I'm trying to make happen. The silence that followed was longer than the others. She looked at me steadily throughout it, with an attention that felt different from the professional assessment of the first day, more direct, somehow, less managed. Seraph, she said at last, do not typically revise assessments of humans upward. Something moved in the pale eyes. We are not, as a people, inclined to find reasons for optimism on that front. We have had the long view for a long time, and it has not always been encouraging. I know, I said. You are suggesting that I was wrong. I'm suggesting that you were working from a limited sample. The people who came here weren't conservators. They were contractors. Another pause. The map behind her, the large luminous one on the north wall, updating its coastal survey data in slow increments, shifted slightly, a stretch of shoreline resolving to a new precision. There is a distinction, she said slowly, that I had not fully considered. There usually is. Something happened to her mouth then. Not quite a smile. The Seraph arrangement of facial muscles doesn't map neatly to human expressions, but the intention of one, the decision to let something through. The colonel, she said, used to say that the difference between a surveyor and a cartographer was that a surveyor measures what is there, and a cartographer asks what it means. He was right. He frequently was. A pause. It was extremely irritating. I laughed. It surprised her, I saw it, the slight recalibration, the attention sharpening, and then the not-quite smile became something more definite. He said that too, she said. About me. The heritage lawyer's name was Dr. Priya Anand, and she drove out from London on day 6 with the energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of case and was not going to waste the opportunity. She and Soul spent 4 hours in the archive room. I stayed in the West Wing and finished my structural assessment, which was thorough and documented and would, I was fairly confident, give the council enough to justify preservation on the grounds of architectural interest alone before you got anywhere near the archive. At 5 o'clock Priya found me in the entrance hall and sat down on the bottom of the staircase with the expression of someone who had just confirmed a very good theory. She's got continuous residency, she said. 135 years of documented occupation, documented improvements to the fabric of the building. She kept records of everything, Marcus. She kept meticulous records. This woman is an archivist's archivist, and the 1903 extension was built to her specifications with the colonel's written consent, which means there's a structural contribution argument as well. The hotel group isn't going to touch this. The council is going to get my letter on Monday, and they're going to call their own lawyers, who are going to tell them the same thing, and then we're going to negotiate a heritage protection designation that makes this the council's crowning preservation achievement instead of their most expensive mistake. She paused. Can you make the structural case strong enough to support designation? I'm going to recommend grade II, I said. Possibly grade I for the East Wing if the environmental system can be properly documented. Priya looked at me for a moment. You came here to assess for demolition, she said. I came here to assess, I said. The assessment is what it is. She shook her head slowly. Marcus, honestly. Is that a problem? No, she said, standing up and dusting off her jacket with the briskness of someone with a train to catch. It is an absolute delight, but no. Sol found me on the roof the next morning. Not an accident. You had to know how to get to the roof of Ashworth Manor, and I had mapped the access route the previous day. But I hadn't mentioned I was going up, and she appeared beside me at the north parapet with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been watching for the right moment. The Surrey Hills were clear in the early light. Below us, the 12 acres of ground spread out, ragged but not unbeautiful old growth at the edges, the remnant kitchen garden, a section near the east wing where the planting was geometric and deliberate and not, I was fairly sure, from the Colonel's era. You're planting, I said, nodding toward it. The soil conditions near the east wing suit Saravith cultivation. I have been growing a small amount of Saravith food flora for about 60 years. It is not a garden in any aesthetically ambitious sense. A pause, but it persists. That's the main thing. The Colonel thought so too. She looked out at the hills. He said, anything that persists under difficult conditions is making a statement and deserves to be listened to. He applied it to buildings, to gardens, and to me, with what I eventually concluded was deliberate equivalence. I looked at the side of her face, the strong profile, the straight black hair moving slightly in the early wind, the terracotta skin catching the low morning light in a way that made the architectural quality of her coloring suddenly very clear to me. She looked in this light exactly like the building she had been living in, not metaphorically. The color was almost precisely matched. Did he choose the brick for you? I said. She turned to look at me. Surprised, I thought, genuinely surprised. Yes, she said after a moment. He wrote in his records that he spent 3 months selecting it. He said, she stopped. What did he say? Her eyes on mine were very steady. He said he wanted the house to look like her home when she saw it from the outside. I held that for a moment. He was a good man, I said. He was, she said. And he was frequently intolerable, and he was right about more things than I wanted him to be, and I missed him for 30 years after he died, which is a relatively short period in Saravith terms, but was not brief in any sense that I experienced it. The morning wind moved across the parapet between us. I'm sorry, I said. Yes, she looked back at the hills. I know you are. That is, she paused, choosing. That is not a thing I expected to receive from a human assessor. It is not a thing I expected to receive in that register from many people. What register? The register that means it. She glanced at me. Humans use that phrase frequently. You use it as though it is a fact. It is a fact. Something in the mirror pale eyes, the depth in them, the old glass quality shifted. Yes, she said, I'm beginning to think it is. I submitted the full assessment at the end of week 2. 37 pages. Structural condition, room-by-room defect schedule, environmental performance data from the East Wing, documented as significant and currently unexplained positive thermal and humidity regulation, because I had decided that was the most accurate, honest description available. Historical and architectural significance. The 1903 extension analysis with reference to Sol's specifications. The archive assessment I had written with her permission and Priya's legal framing. My recommendation, grade II listing for the main house and west wing, grade I listing for the east wing and its archive environment pending Saravith Cultural Heritage consultation, retention and preservation. The structural defects to the west wing were repairable at standard rates. Total estimated conservation work, 18 months. I noted that the building had demonstrated exceptional structural stability during assessment, and that previous reports of compromised integrity did not reflect current conditions. I did not speculate about why. Hargreaves called 3 days after receiving it. "Webb," he said. "Hargreaves. Grade I. For the East Wing, yes. The archive environment is genuinely unprecedented. I'm not going to understate that in a professional document." A long pause. "The hotel group is going to find a different plot." I waited. "I've submitted the evidence. The decision is the council's." Another pause, longer. "The previous reports all said the building was compromised," he said. "I know. You're saying it isn't. I'm saying it is sound, well-maintained in the East Wing, repairable in the West, and in possession of a resident with 135 years of continuous occupation and the best documented archive of Serapith survey work currently accessible on Earth." I paused. "I'm also saying that if the council demolishes it, the Heritage Press will be interested in the story. The Serapith Cultural Mission, who Priya has already contacted, will be interested in the story, and I will be available for comment." Silence of a very specific quality. "I see," Hargreaves said. "I'll wait for the decision." The listing was confirmed 6 weeks later. I was in Bristol on another job when the letter came. I read it in a car park and then called Priya, who had been waiting, and made a sound of profound professional satisfaction. Then I called the manor. The number was one I'd left with Sol on a piece of paper on the archive room table, knowing she wouldn't have called it first. She picked up after 4 rings. "The listing is confirmed," I said. "Grade II for the main house, Grade I for the East Wing. The council has agreed to fund the first phase of conservation work. Priya is working on the formal residency documentation." A pause, long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. "Sol." "I am here," she said. Her voice was the same as always, measured, precise, that academic English diction with the long practice underneath it. But there was something in it that was not quite the same as always. A quality that I'd heard once before, briefly, when I told her the collection was extraordinary. The sound of something that had been managed for a very long time meeting something it did not expect and deciding, carefully, not to contain it. "The collection is secured. The collection is secured." Another pause. 135 years, she said quietly. "I have been here 135 years, and there has always been a possibility in the background that it would end, that the house would come down and I would be unable to prevent it and the work would be lost." She paused. I had made a kind of peace with that possibility. I told myself it was acceptable because I had maintained the collection for as long as I could. But I did not. Another pause. I did not entirely believe that. "No," I said. "You were still here. You wouldn't have stayed if you'd fully accepted it." The silence that followed was different from the others, softer, somehow. "I am going to tend the garden," she said at last. "Good," I said. "It is not a good garden." "I have said so." "Tend it anyway." "Yes," a very small pause. "Marcus." "Yes." "Thank you." I stood in the Bristol car park in the early November gray and thought about the house and the archive and the woman who had built both into what they were over 135 years, and had been doing it alone, and had stopped, finally, waiting to see what the house would do. "You're welcome," I said. "I'll be back in 3 weeks for the conservation planning meeting. I'll call ahead." "I will be here," she said, with a certainty that had nothing anxious in it anymore. I came back in 3 weeks, and then the week after that for the structural engineer consultations, and the week after that because the West Wing joist work had started and I wanted to see the first phase, and somewhere in that run of weeks, I stopped calculating the driving time from Bristol as a consideration. Sol did not comment on the frequency of my returns. She made tea that had, by the fourth visit, improved considerably toward human preference, which she had not mentioned working on. She showed me the sections of the archive she was reorganizing now that the pressure of potential demolition had lifted, and the reorganization was extraordinary. Not just the contents but the thinking behind it, the way she moved through hundreds of years of survey data as though it were a landscape she knew by heart. I watched her work and thought about the Colonel's letter, which she had shown me on my second return visit, the entry about the brick. I thought about a man who had spent 3 months matching the color of a house to the woman he was building it for, and who had been right about her in the way that mattered, not sentimentally, but architecturally. He had understood what she needed and built it, and that was a form of love I could read in the fabric of the building, in every deliberate proportion of the 1903 extension, in the way the east wing faced. I was measuring a section of the upper corridor, real work, specification work, numbers that needed to be right, when she appeared behind me. "You are muttering," she said. "I mutter when I measure. It helps me keep the figures." "You mutter the figures and then add commentary." "What kind of commentary?" She considered. "Last week you said that's wrong, but it's wrong beautifully about the 1958 extension." "That is accurate. The 1958 edition has no structural logic whatsoever, but the proportions of the windows work against the original elevation in a way I cannot fully explain, and I've decided it's either accidental genius or the house decided to keep it." A pause. "I have always thought it the latter." "I know, I've revised toward that view." I felt her attention behind me in the way you can feel an open window. The quality of the air changes. I turned. She was closer than I'd expected, though the corridor was wide enough that there was still professional distance between us. The morning light from the east-facing window caught the side of her face and the faint geometric markings at her collar, and she was looking at me with an expression that was not managed in the way her earlier expressions had been. "You came back," she said, quietly and directly, which was her way, but the tone was not the tone of a factual observation. "I said I would. People say many things." "I know." I held her gaze. "I came back." She looked at me for a long moment in the morning light of the corridor, in the house that had chosen to hold rather than fall, and I watched the last of the careful management give way to something that had been there from the beginning, building slowly in the way the east wing had built itself, without drama, without announcement, by increments, until it was simply a fact of the architecture. "The Colonel," she said at last, wrote in his final entry that he had always intended to find her a worthy successor. Her voice was even. "He said he had not in his lifetime managed it. He said, 'I regret only that I ran out of time.'" The corridor was very quiet. "He wrote that," I said carefully, "about you." "Yes." I thought about a man who had built a house to match a woman's color, who had given her the east wing and designed it to her specifications, who had spent 3 months on brick selection, and had said, finally, that the best architectural decision of his considerable career had been to give her what she needed. "I think," I said, "he would have revised that regret." She looked at me. The mirror-pale eyes, the depth in them, the old glass quality that held something rather than reflecting it. "Yes," she said, and her voice had in it the sound of something long maintained making way for something new, a structural shift that changes the load-bearing logic of an entire building without weakening it, that in fact strengthens it, that makes it, in the right hands, assessed correctly, documented honestly, something that lasts. I think he would have too. The conservation work completed the following autumn. The west wing joists were sistered and stabilized. The chimney stack was repointed. The external wall damp was resolved with a lime-based consolidation approach that matched the original materials. The east wing was left entirely to its own environmental management, which continued to perform at tolerances I had documented and could not explain and had, at this point, Stop trying to. The house did not add any rooms that I was aware of during the works, but the count at the final measured survey was 3 more than the council's original record. I did not raise this in the final report. Some things a building keeps to itself, and a good conservator knows which questions are his to ask and which belong to the house. The archive was formally recognized under Joint Earth-Saravith Cultural Heritage Protocols the following spring. The Saravith Cultural Mission sent a delegation that arrived, went through the archive with Sol for 2 days, and left in what Priya described as a state of institutional embarrassment, having spent 125 years considering the collection lost. Sol showed me the formal recognition certificate on the day it arrived. It was, as certificates go, remarkable, dual language, dual script, with the geometric Saravith designation running alongside the English, and at the bottom in both scripts her full name, all 14 syllables of it. She pointed to the Saravith text. "This is what it says," she said. "The first part is the designation, the second part is the institution." "What's the institution?" She was quiet for a moment. "The colonel's name. In the Saravith archive system, a collection is designated to the person who protected it first. He was the first. I am listed as his successor." I looked at the certificate, at the 14-syllable name and the colonel's name beside it, 135 years apart and finally, formally, together in the same document. "That's right," I said. "Yes," her voice was very quiet, "it is." We were in the entrance hall, where I had stood on the first morning with my measuring tape, reading the building. The encaustic tile was the same, red and black and cream, and the staircase was the same, and the house held us both in the cool, mineral-scented air of a space that had been built for exactly this. "I would like," she said, with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing words that will stay, "to show you the full navigation collection. I have not shown it to anyone since the colonel. There is a section of star map material from the 3rd century of the archive that I think you would," she paused. "I think you would read correctly." "Yes," I said, "I'd like that." She led me up the staircase. The house settled around us, not the settling of a building under stress, but the settling of a building that has found its configuration and is content with the load it's carrying, which is, in conservation terms, the best possible outcome, which is, in any terms, a good thing to be. The formal plaque on the east wing reads, "Ashworth Sol Archive, established 1889, protected in perpetuity. In the Joint Accords record it is listed under Cultural Heritage, active. The rosemary in the Saravith garden came back the spring after the conservation works, which Sol noted in her records without theorizing about it. The house has not had a structural incident since the 4th assessor's first visit, which he has also noted in his records and has also not theorized about. He visits every 6 weeks. The house always lets him in.